WAR. Wins above replacement. It's a stat I've used frequently in my videos, and every time I do, I hear a lot about it in the comments section.
WAR is an absolutely terrible metric. Imagine going back to the 80s and describing a metric that no one can realistically verify. Tells you literally nothing about the player. Pitcher, big hitter, slick fielder. Can change for a player even when he takes the day off, and despite its incredible imprecision, typically plus or minus 20%, is always calculated to a false accuracy to fool uninformed fans into believing it's an authoritative measure of performance. Brilliant! WAR is overrated and for halfway fans who don't understand the eye test.
This just shows how useless every version of WAR really is.
Oh yes, very scientific. The only measurement is a wholly speculative, made-up stat. One that you doubtless have no understanding of, because if you did, you literally would never use it. Because it's a stat specifically for people who like math a lot more than they like sports. It's the thing I hate most about baseball. It's the only sport that attracts these nerds who have no understanding of athletic competition. I want you to answer me honestly. Do you actually understand how they calculate WAR? There are several different ways to do it. They're all highly neurodivergent and quite frankly anti-athletic. You already have Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons. Were you also bored with it that you had to come and ruin sport?
Now, I don't know how my rabid fandom of the Imperium's 18th Legion takes away from your enjoyment of baseball, but I get the sense that some people don't like WAR at all. Now, I've used WAR a lot and will defend my usage of WAR, but the comments that I read do bring up a good point. There are very few people, even in the baseball industry, that know how WAR is calculated inside and out. I'll even admit that I have a good general overview of what it's doing and what it's measuring, but the specific details of some of the formulas I don't have down pat. Feel like I need to rectify that, so I did a practical experiment. Using a number generator, I selected a random day in baseball history, which ended up being April 22nd, 1993, and from scratch, just being guided by the Fangraphs articles explaining how they calculate WAR, I'm going to calculate WAR for every player on that day. When I mean from scratch, I mean completely from scratch. I ignored Fangraphs' guts page that gives you all the coefficients and makes it easy, the run expectancy matrix. All of that I calculated painstakingly by hand, and it was incredibly time-consuming and included a bit of frustration. Okay, if I did this right, this whole column should add up to 0. Ugh.
2 hours later.
Okay, I think I found the issue. This whole column now should add up to 0. Son of a...
2 hours later.
For the love of all that is holy, please add up to 0. Oh God, thank you. Now to do the same thing another 4 times and I'll have position players done. What was the point of this exercise? Well, now I've got a heck of an understanding of what's going on in WAR calculations. Having said that, there's a number of things that either seem like shortcuts, legacy formulas that haven't been updated, information that we just don't have access to, or just don't make a lot of sense that could easily be fixed with a few tweaks. And we're gonna go into all that. If you really want to understand what goes into WAR, its strengths, its weaknesses, and how WAR is stupid, sometimes, this is the video for you. Also gonna look into some recommendations for Fangraphs to improve F4. All of that after the intro. First, need a general overview of what WAR is. It attempts to measure a player's contributions as a hitter, fielder, base runner, and pitcher, and turn that into a value of runs added. Then those runs are adjusted into how many wins the player added, which are then compared to a replacement level player to give a total wins above replacement. First thing, replacement level player. I really hate the term, and it causes confusion as people take it way too literally. It's commonly explained as the average AAA minor leaguer that would be called up as a replacement if the major league player were hurt or not on the roster. But that's not true in reality. Teams call up many players throughout the season. In 2022, the average team used over 50 players. Players numbered 27 through 50 on the roster, those that wouldn't be on the team if everyone was healthy, are not all at a replacement level. Some will put up positive WAR, many of them will post negative WAR. In 2021, 554 players accumulated negative WAR on the season. So about a third of the league was worse than some hypothetical call-up from AAA. Now that doesn't make any sense because many of those guys are the players that are called up from AAA. So what's going on? Why does this stat mention a replacement level player that doesn't really seem to exist? The WAR formula at its simplest is just wins above average plus a replacement level adjustment. By definition, wins above average for the entire league will always add up to 0, so the replacement level is defined by the total amount of WAR either Fangraphs, Baseball Reference or Baseball Prospectus decide to give out for the entire league. Prior to 2013, Fangraphs said that amount would be 1,142 WAR, which comes out to a replacement level team finishing with about 43 wins. Baseball Reference said that amount would be 875, which comes to a replacement level team finishing with about 52 wins. Now, them having very different values for replacement level made their player evaluations all over the map. So finally, they both got together and decided to unify and say that the total amount given out would be 1,000 on the dot. This puts replacement level close to 48 wins. So this is not some scientific, here's what a replacement call-up from AAA would produce in the majors, but more of a general, this is what we agreed on for the baseline for replacement level because it seemed about right and was near the middle of our two estimates. Nobody should take it too literally, like this article concluding if a player's replacement is not as good as them, their WAR will be significantly better. That's completely wrong, as the player's direct backup has no bearing on their individual WAR. But considering how much importance is put on this hypothetical replacement player in the definition, I can understand some people incorrectly thinking this. So that's one weak point. Already has some confusion with the name. But I'm going to counter that with what I think the strongest part of F-WAR is, and that's calculating a player's value with the bat. F-WAR's hitting runs is calculated using WOBA, or weighted on base average. First, you start with a run expectancy matrix, which is calculated using every single plate appearance in a season. Every time there's nobody on with no outs, so the start of every inning, you find out how many times that happened, how many total runs were scored after that situation, take the runs divided by the number of times, and you get the average number of runs in that situation. On my one-day example, this came to 0.4233 runs. You do the same average for every situation. Nobody on with one out, runners on first and third with two outs, runner on second with nobody out, and you fill out the chart completely. Then you look at different types of events, singles, doubles, triples, home runs, walks, and take the run expectancy before that event happened versus the run expectancy after. For example, on the day I looked at, there were a total of 121 singles. Let's look at this one by Jose Oquendo in the bottom of the seventh of the Rockies at the Cardinals. There was one out with a runner on first, and after the single, there was one out with runners on first and second. You look at the run expectancy matrix of one out with runners on first and second, which gives 0.666 repeating runs, and minus the value of one out with runners on first, which is 0.4194 runs, which gives the final value of that single of 0.2472 runs. Now, this is important. WAR is not situationally dependent. Oquendo does not get 0.2472 runs added to his total. Instead, we do the same calculation for all 121 singles. Take the after the singles run expectancy minus the before, and then average the value we get for all 121. We do that, the average value of a single on this way is 0.335 runs. So anytime any player hits a single on this day, whether it's with the bases empty or the bases loaded, they get credit for 0.335 runs. Now you do the same thing for doubles, triples, home runs, hit by pitches, and walks, and you get an average value for each of them. This is what Fangraphs is showing on their guts page. In 2022, the average value for a single was 0.884 runs. A home run was 2.072 runs. Now for the day I calculated, which was April 22nd, 1993, it was a pretty low scoring day, including a no-hitter by Chris Bosio of the Mariners, so the values I got were a little bit lower than 2022. But that's basically it for how F-WAR calculates batting wins, and I like that calculation a lot. It's completely derived from situations that actually happened that year, and every tool used, from the run expectancy matrix to the linear weights of types of hits, comes from hundreds of thousands of real examples that are constantly being updated as the run environment changes. But this is the strongest point of WAR, and what I looked at first, and I thought everything else, base running, fielding, pitching, was gonna be calculated in a similar manner. Find the average value of a strikeout each year, find the average value of a stolen base, and so on. It would be consistent and make a lot of sense to do that. But that's not what happens, and some of the calculations drive me up the wall. So here we go. Here's why WAR is stupid. Sometimes. First, going into base running. As I was starting my calculations for that day, I was already setting it up so I could calculate a linear weight for stolen bases. Look at the run expectancy before a stolen base and after, and do the same for caught stealing, thinking it would be calculated the same way batting runs are. But that's not what Fangraphs does. Instead, they say the value of a stolen base is always 0.2 runs, which, thinking about it for a second, that doesn't make sense. Batting averages in the 1920s were 40 points higher than in the 2020s. You'd expect the likelihood of a runner scoring from second in 1920 to be higher than 2020, so a stolen base should have more value for those years. Meanwhile, 2019 had way more home runs than any other year, so you'd expect the likelihood of a runner scoring from first to be higher than 1920, so a stolen base should have less value. If the value of a walk changes year to year, why wouldn't the value of a stolen base? I don't know why Fangraphs sticks with 0.2 runs no matter what, especially with all the effort taken to figure out the value of a walk for every season. It doesn't seem like it'd be that hard for them to do year-to-year calculations for stolen bases as well. And then we get to caught stealing, which if you look at the guts page, doesn't stay static. So they're using the run expectancy chart to come up with those numbers, right? No. They plug it into a formula that doesn't make much intuitive sense to me. Why do you add 0.75 at the end? Why do you multiply by 2? You're going to see this complaint a lot from me going forward. Any numbers that are either static year to year or have static multipliers or coefficients drive me up the wall because they don't take into account the changing run environments or the overall game changing, which as we saw with hitting runs is something they can clearly do in the calculations. Now we get to the thing that really gets a lot of criticism, the positional adjustment. With the Ohtani versus Judge MVP race last season, there was a lot of attention brought to the DH adjustment and how it may hurt Ohtani by lowering his WAR. I'm not going to make the argument whether the positional adjustment is too big or too small, but I will say that it doesn't seem right. Like other aspects of WAR we've looked at, it's a group of numbers that doesn't change year to year. But since 1950, the number of balls put in play per game has dropped by about 25%, meaning positional adjustment shouldn't be as large in recent years as it was in the 1950s, as position isn't as important. It's especially concerning because Fangraphs themselves say these numbers were based on some calculations that were done about a decade ago, and it's certainly reasonable to suggest that these numbers have changed as the game has changed. And they link to a study from 2015 that suggests that positional adjustments should change anywhere from 3 to 7 runs per position. But in calculating the numbers, especially in a non-universal DH environment, brought something to my attention that's even more confusing about the positional adjustment. Now this portion of the video, I'm not 100% convinced I'm right, as it's kind of confusing and there may be some other sort of adjustment that I'm not seeing. But Fangraphs says the league adjustment is a small correction to make it so that each league's runs above average balances out to 0. Each league's batting runs, plus base running runs, plus fielding runs, plus positional adjustment often totals something slightly different than 0. The league adjustment fixes this and has a very tiny impact on player value. Let's dig into that because it has some implications. WAR's formula, when you really break it down, is hitting runs above average, plus base running runs above average, plus fielding runs above average, plus positional adjustment, plus replacement level value. And from 2013 to 2019, when there were 15 teams in each league and no universal DH, you can simplify this for each league to hitting runs above average, plus base running runs above average, plus fielding runs above average, plus positional adjustment, plus replacement level equals 285. Those first 3 terms, by definition, will always equal 0 for the entire league. Depending on how Fangraphs does the rounding, maybe you'll have a slight rounding error or remainder, but in essence, they will always equal 0. The positional adjustment should also equal 0. For the National League in those years, you add up the positional adjustment and sure enough, you get 0. So that makes the formula for the National League 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus replacement level equals 285. So the replacement level given out to National League players in that year will equal 285. It sounds a little chaotic, but this makes perfect sense when you dig into the WAR calculations. But for the American League, it's a little weird. Adding in the DH positional adjustment and the overall league positional adjustment will be a negative number. After doing the math for a whole season equals to about negative 30 for the whole league. So for the American League, the formula now becomes 0 plus 0 plus 0 minus 30 plus replacement level equals 285. Solve for replacement level and you get 315, which it should equal 285. When Fangraphs says the league adjustment is a small correction to make it so each league's runs above average balances out to 0, the only thing that applies to is the fact that the positional adjustment for the American League prior to Universal DH was a negative number that doesn't equal 0. So what does all that mean for the individual player? It means the replacement level added to each player is about 10% larger in the AL than it is in the NL prior to Universal DH. That means if you have 2 shortstops, one in the NL, one in the AL, and they have identical playing time, hitting runs, base running runs, and fielding runs in one season, the one in the AL is going to get about 10% more WAR. Again, I haven't been able to verify this, and Fangraphs may do some adjustment with offensive and defensive pitcher valuations in the NL to compensate for this, but if they do that, they don't spell it out on their website. I also try to find a player in each league in the same year that had almost identical playing time, hitting runs, base running runs, fielding runs, and played the same position to verify this, but couldn't find a good example. Regardless, now that we have universal DH, the positional adjustments should be redone so they at least add up to 0 now. So this in-the-end adjustment that Fangraphs does isn't necessary anymore. I would also love if they recalculate these positional adjustments every season so they stay in line with baseball changing. So this covers everything on the position player side that I take issue with. Now let's jump into pitching. Fangraphs Pitcher WAR is based nearly 100% on FIP, or fielding independent pitching, which I find absolutely insane. Now, FIP isn't a bad stat. People have shown that it correlates more with a pitcher's future ERA than ERA itself, but it absolutely misses the mark every once in a while with certain styles of pitchers. Now, changing the formula for FIP itself to account for this probably isn't necessary and would be confusing for most fans, but changing how Fangraphs calculates pitcher WAR using FIP should absolutely account for this. Fangraphs already says, unfortunately for those of you playing at home, you can't simply take a pitcher's FIP from their player page because we treat infield fly balls, IFFB, as strikeouts for the purposes of WAR, but not for the general FIP calculation found on a player's page. So they're already making changes to FIP when calculating WAR to make it more accurate. Why not go a step further? So here's my rant on why FIP sucks for calculating WAR and how to fix that. The formula for FIP is 13 times home runs plus 3 times walks minus 2 times strikeouts divided by innings pitched plus a constant. Those home runs, walks, and strikeouts simplify to per inning stats. I want to give you 3 scenarios and you tell me which one's the best. Scenario 1, relief pitcher comes in with 2 outs, gives up 10 doubles in a row, all hit incredibly hard and hit off the top of the wall, and then strikes out the 11th batter. 2, relief pitcher comes in with 2 outs. The defense commits 5 errors in a row on balls put in play that should have been easy outs, and then the pitcher strikes out the 6th batter. 3, relief pitcher comes in with 2 outs and strikes out the first batter they face on 3 swinging strikes. FIP considers all of those appearances as equal. No home runs per inning, no walks per inning, and a perfect 3 strikeouts per inning. Even worse, in scenario 2, if the fielders had made the easy play to get the out, it would have considered that pitcher's performance worse than the other 2, as they'd also have 0 strikeouts per inning. It completely ignores that the first pitcher allowed 10 balls in play with really hard contact and wasn't missing any bats. The second pitcher allowed 5 balls in play with weaker contact, and the third pitcher was perfect with nobody even coming close to making contact. This illustrates 2 glaring issues. FIP completely ignores how much contact batters make as long as the pitcher isn't giving up home runs, and FIP can be impacted by defense because errors extend innings, which impact per inning rate stats. An easy fix for both of these issues is to change the FIP calculation to strikeout percentage, walk percentage, and home run percentage instead of strikeout per inning, walks per inning, and home runs per inning. Then any ball put in play is accounted for. The player that gave up the 10 doubles, their strikeout percentage would be much lower than that pitcher that struck out their first batter. I'll give you another weird edge case with a question. What's the most valuable thing a pitcher can do to improve their FIP? Most of you out there familiar with the FIP formula are probably saying strikeout right now, but that's an incomplete answer. A strikeout with a passed ball where the batter gets safely to first is the most valuable thing you can do in FIP. That's right, the most valuable thing in fielding independent pitching is a play where the fielders make an error. I stumbled on this because on the day that I calculated the league WAR, reliever Dwayne Ward of the Blue Jays had an outing that included a passed ball on a 3rd strike. The runner reached first, and Ward finished the inning with 2 strikeouts and 2 infield pop-ups, which remember, FWAR treats those infield pop-ups the same as strikeouts. So in essence, for FWAR calculations, it was a 4-strikeout inning. Ward ended up with a FIP of minus 5.62, even though his real ERA for the outing was 9. But again, this is easily fixable by changing FIP to using percent stats instead of per inning stats. That just fixes one aspect of FIP when calculating WAR. Another issue is that the constants stay static regardless of the hitting environment. It's always going to be 13, 3, and -2. If you look at the Fangraphs Guts page, the value of a home run has changed by as much as 30% over the years. The value of a walk has changed by as much as over 20% over the years. I'm guessing the value of a strikeout has changed as well. It would be pretty easy for Fangraphs to do a similar thing and have the FIP coefficients be calculated year to year to adjust for the changing values of home runs, walks, and strikeouts. That's 2 pretty small changes that would make FIP considerably more accurate and have a lot fewer edge cases where FIP completely misses the mark. However, the next problem in pitcher WAR calculations is a bit more head-scratching. Here's another scenario for you. What performance should have more WAR? A relief pitcher coming in the 6th inning of a tie game and striking out the side, or a starting pitcher striking out the side in the 1st inning and then coming out of the game, like an opener might do? the second one gets more WAR according to Fangraphs. The replacement level value added to each pitcher is different for starters and relievers. It's 0.12 runs for 9 innings for a starter, while only 0.03 runs per 9 innings for a reliever. Fangraphs is saying that an inning pitched by a starter is inherently more valuable than a reliever, and I haven't found a good explanation for this. Yes, relievers are usually more effective than starters because they're able to go harder since their outings are shorter, but an out is an out. Going back to hitter runs, in that calculation, a single is a single, and all singles are equal. On the pitching side, it seems a lot like Animal Farm. All outs are equal, but some outs are more equal. Maybe someone from Fangraphs can explain this one to me, but it makes more sense to have the replacement level per 9 innings be the same for all pitchers, which would end up being close to 0.085 to keep their overall numbers consistent. Now, knowing all of these issues, why do I defend my usage of WAR? Every video where I use WAR, I'm looking at larger samples. For the best draft classes and international amateurs, I'm looking at the sum careers of multiple players. For the best and worst contracts, I'm looking at a minimum of 4 years for an individual player and 5 to 10 years for most of the contracts. Yes, the issues I identified will cause some variations, but over a large enough sample, those tend to cancel out. And if I try to do rankings like I've done using traditional stats, I have to look at multiple stats, weigh them in certain ways, and in the end I'll just end up with a worse version of WAR. WAR, for all its faults, is currently the best tool we have to compare large sample sizes between players. It's not perfect, and certain players will either be penalized or get an advantage if they have styles of play that differ from the norm, as I showed in my Nolan Ryan video, or considering career WAR for designated hitters. But for 95% of players, those differences are minimal and come out in the wash for large sample sizes. I love being able to compare things like draft classes, massive contracts, and 5-year peak performance level, and WAR, honestly, is the best tool we have to do that. Is it objective? Is it perfect? Not even close. And I'd love if Fangraphs, as well as Baseball Reference and Baseball Perspectives, looked into some of the things I brought up in this video. But it's really fun to use WAR to compare certain historical aspects of baseball, and honestly, it excels in doing that in most cases. I want to close this out by saying thanks to some of the members of the baseball YouTube community that helped iron out a script that was very math heavy and a technical subject. Special thanks to the Lefty Catcher, No More Fielders, and Baseball AF for helping me workshop the script a bit to make it not nearly as dry as it was originally going to be, if you can believe that. I linked to their channels in the video description, as well as a link to the Excel file for my 1 day in baseball WAR calculations. If you like this type of content, you may like their videos as well, so drop a like and subscribe here and then go check out their channels.